Hello and welcome back to training session 2. Thank you for taking part in the first of the training sessions about becoming a volunteer at Fishbourne Primary School. This one is a much more specific training session. It's a little bit longer than the first one. I just want to mention to you right now that you need to have a piece of paper and a pen in front of you, and before having started this training, we would like you please to have made sure you've had a look at this document, Keeping Children Safe in Education. It is a prerequisite that everybody who volunteers at Fishbourne Primary School has read this document, and you'll be asked to sign off to say that you have done so. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to share my screen with you, and then we will get started on our training. I'm going to start by talking about what we aim to get out of this session. As I said, it's quite a long session, there's quite a lot to get through, but we hope it will be really helpful. It's been written, this session, specifically for the staff and volunteers at Fishbourne Primary School, with carefully chosen case studies, which we hope will really guide you on your way through understanding what your role as a volunteer at Fishbourne Primary is. So let's start off by just talking about what we aim to get out of the session. So for some of you, it will be about refreshing. For others, it will be about increasing your awareness of the responsibilities that you have as a volunteer at Fishbourne Primary School to safeguard the children who come to the school. It's also about understanding our safeguarding policy and the protocols we have at school, which were most recently updated in September 2020. And when Keeping Children Safe in Education is published again, that will be updated, and we will do further training for volunteers as an update of any key changes. The third element of the training today really is around ensuring that you are confident with your role and the part that you play in safeguarding at the school. And we have 4 R's that we talk about a lot at Fishbourne: recognising signs of possible abuse, responding appropriately, reporting concerns, and recording your observations. Those 4 R's are guiding principles that go through everything that we do. We're going to guide you through that training this morning, and we really hope that will be helpful. Before we go any further, I just want to encourage you in your role and what an important role it will be as a volunteer. You are an everyday hero in our eyes. Now, this lady you can see in the middle of our screen is a lady called Jazz Ampar, and she has recorded a really important message for schools up and down the country. You can view that message yourself if you just put into YouTube Jazz Ampar, The Power of Everyday Heroes. You can see her full speech. We shared this as a staff team, and we picked out the key messages, the things that she said that really resonated with us. She said school meant everything to her. It wasn't the rescue that had the impact for me, it was the fact that he cared and he stood up for me, and she's referring to her teacher there. They held a vision of success. If you remember last week with our quote about championing children, about the power of connection, and insisting that children are the best they can possibly be, that's what Jazz talks about, but the impact that her teacher has on her. They asked me how I was every single day. He waited for me to try, and he stood there and smiled the biggest smile. These adults enabled a broken little girl to become me. They believed in me. Such powerful messages from a woman who, when she was attending school at primary age, was being abused, and it was as a result of the school picking up on it, recognising the signs, that she was rescued and went on to become an incredibly successful woman. If you have a chance to watch her talk, it is well worth the time. You may need a box of tissues as well. But I think the key message for us as educators, and for those of us who have the privilege of working alongside young people, is that we play a really important role in their lives, and we very often are the people who pick up when there is some sort of problem. Okay, so the key principle, the key message for you to take away from the training today is that safeguarding is everyone's responsibility, and that for services to be effective, every single professional and organisation needs to play their part. By coming to support learning at Fishbourne Primary School as a volunteer, you have a role to play in that safeguarding, and today we will be unpicking what that role is. Okay, so as I've already said at the beginning, we are clear that everybody who is here in school, in whatever role, whether it's a teacher, a learning support assistant, a member of the office staff, a member of the premises staff, we all have a role to play, and therefore we all need to have read that document, Keeping Children Safe in Education, Part 1. There's a statutory requirement for you to have read that, okay? And as I said, you will be asked to sign to say that you have done so. Okay, so we move on to the first main part of our training, which is around recognising the signs of potential abuse. Now, we know that in schools currently up and down the country, these are some of the current causes of concern. And you can see there is a huge range of concerns that we have for young people in schools in England. I'm not going to read them all out to you, but you can see that there's a tremendous amount there. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look to see how we would know that some of these issues are impacting on our young people. How do we recognise those signs? So, we classify abuse in 4 potential ways. We've got physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, which is also sometimes known as sexual exploitation, and the 4th, which is neglect. Now, in West Sussex currently, neglect is an area that we are receiving a lot of additional training in schools. There are many different forms of neglect, and that's a specialist piece of training that we're doing with our staff, our teachers and our learning support assistants. But it's certainly a word to be aware of, and recognising those signs of a child being neglected is a really key part of our role in schools at the moment. Okay, so we have mentioned those different sorts of abuse. We've looked at some of the different factors that we are looking out for in schools at the moment. During the course of the training today, we're going to explore a couple of case studies, which is why we've asked you to have a piece of paper and a pen in front of you so that you can jot down notes. So our first case study is centred around somebody called Sally at the Children and Family Centre. And we're going to ask you to listen to what Sally says and think about what you feel the possible signs and indicators of abuse may be. Now remember, those signs can be either physical, they could be behavioural, or about the way in which the parent or carer responds to the child. So I'm just going to ask you to listen to what Sally, who is one of the workers at the Children and Family Centre, says. We get on fine with the families here. I don't want to do anything to rock the boat, but I do have a few concerns. It's not been easy for the family lately. Money is really tight for them. Dad's left a dozen times and he always comes back. They live in an old flat. It should be pulled down, really. She's white and he's Jamaican. Seems to me she's taking it all out on the girl. She really walloped her one day last week when she was picking her up from nursery, and today she's got these red marks all down one leg. If the other mums here I've been on the phone to social services, it will be a real uphill struggle to get them to come back. Okay, I'm just going to give you a moment to jot down what you feel some of the possible signs and indicators of abuse may be in that disclosure made by one of the members of staff. You may want to pause the film just to give yourself time to do that rather than me putting big pauses into the film itself. Okay. Now here we've got some of the possible indicators. Which of these things do you think might be signs and indicators of abuse? Some of them are, and some of them aren't. Okay, if we take each of those things, just have a reflect on whether we think they are an indicator of abuse. So it's not been easy for the family recently. Is that an indicator of abuse? Well, not necessarily. It would depend on what hasn't been easy for the family. Some of our families we know are more vulnerable as a result of their experiences they have. Money is tight. Is that an indicator of abuse? Well, again, not necessarily. Lots of our families have issues around money and living on a very, very tight budget. It doesn't mean that children are at any greater risk of abuse. Dad's left a dozen times and always comes back. Is that an indicator of abuse? Again, not necessarily, but it might mean that home is quite unsettled. They live in an old flat, it should be pulled down. Is that an indicator of abuse? Not necessarily, although it might be that that child is living in a home that is quite a stressful place to be. She's white and he's Jamaican. Is that a sign of abuse? Absolutely not. Seeing mum taking it out on the child. Well, now our alarm bells might be starting to ring a little bit, and we might be wanting to ask some more questions about that. In what ways some of those stressful situations are being taken out on that child. Really walloped her last week. Okay, now we're moving into the territory of possible physical abuse. If that has been seen happening, there may be a need to make a referral. Has red marks on her leg, another cause for concern that is cropping up there. The final point on this PowerPoint slide is really important to acknowledge. It's an uphill struggle to get families here, so we don't want to rock the boat. Now that's a professional person at a children and families centre making that statement. We know that regardless of the relationships that we have with families, if we have a concern, we must report it, regardless of wanting to keep things nice and smooth between us and our families. We cannot say we can't make a referral because we don't want to upset families. So that's really important that we're clear that her saying that, I don't want to do anything to rock the boat, that is not a reason not to refer. Later on in our presentation, we will talk about some of the reasons that professionals have not reported concerns in the past and why we have to be so clear that we cannot give those reasons for not making referrals. Okay. Responding appropriately. When a child or an adult makes a disclosure, there are some golden rules about what you should and shouldn't do. Sometimes it can be quite an overwhelming feeling when a child starts to talk to an adult and starts to make a disclosure. It's really important that we feel equipped and confident that we know how to respond in those circumstances. So here we've got some do's and don'ts. And then what we're going to do in a moment is we're going to have a go at listening to a child making a disclosure and thinking really deeply about what we may or may not say in response to that disclosure afterwards. So here are the golden rules. Do be approachable. If a child comes and sits down and starts talking to you, then really encourage them to talk. It's really important. It's important that you stay calm while children are talking. They will be watching very carefully to see how we respond in any given situation to whatever they say. It's important that we keep a calm head as they're talking. Listen carefully, be proactive in your listening, and don't be critical. Work at the children's pace. Take what they say seriously. Make sure that you clarify any essential information as a child is talking. There may be things that you want them to repeat. That is important, just to make sure that you've heard that correctly. Reassure them. Tell the child what will happen next, and in the event of you as a volunteer having a disclosure, it would be that you're going to talk to the class teacher to talk to them about how we can help. The next thing here, it says tell the designated senior person without delay. That's the same as speaking to the class teacher. We will talk about who the safeguarding leads are, but I would certainly say in your role as a volunteer, your next step is to speak to the class teacher, who may well say, go and have a chat with Naomi, and that's absolutely fine. Record using the child's wording. Don't interpret what they've said. And again, we will have a case study later on in this training to support you in having a go at doing that. There are some key things not to do. It's not your job to investigate, not your job to try and resolve it and come up with a solution. It's really important that we don't make negative comments about the situation that they're disclosing. Don't promise to keep things a secret. Really important that you're clear with a child that you will have to take action based on what they've said, and that you will be speaking to the class teacher with very much the focus on wanting to get the right help for that child. And also don't make assumptions. It's really important, and very often in the conversations that I have with parents, I make it very clear to our parent community that it's not my job to investigate or to make a judgment about what has or hasn't happened, but it is my job, it's my professional duty to seek help and support for a family where we think there may be a need for it. Okay, so we're going to have a go now at responding to a child who has made a disclosure. This is the context of this disclosure. You are a member of staff who has offered to help coach a girls' football team after school on a Wednesday in the local park. Jacey is a new player and she's very small for her age. You've tried to talk to her during the sessions, and she's very jumpy and she keeps her head down whenever anyone speaks to her. She really comes to life on the football pitch and is very skillful and quick. Since Jacey has been on the football team, you've noticed her clothes are often too dirty and too small. One afternoon when she comes out of the changing room, you notice that she has been crying. Okay, and in our previous slide we talked about being approachable, didn't we? And this might be where you check in with Jacey to find out how she's doing. And this is what Jacey said in response to that question. The other girls keep having a go at me and they call me smelly. They hold their noses when they're near me. Ruby's the worst. She's really mean and always picks on me. And today she told the others I'm a thief because she saw me taking food out the bins, but it's not like I was nicking it. Mum doesn't get out of bed in the morning and there's never any food in our house, so we don't get breakfast. She spends more on booze than on food. My nan says that Mum doesn't take care of us properly. She gave my mum money to buy a winter coat, but she bought vodka instead. I get cold walking to school. I think if my dad was still around, things would be different. Can I stay here for a while? Because Ruby says she'll be waiting for me outside. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is just have a think about what you might have said to Jacey after all of that disclosure had come tumbling out of her mouth. How are you going to respond? What's the first thing that you're going to say to Jacey in response to that? Okay, so here are some of the possibilities, things that you might have said. Can you stop for a moment so I can write this all down? Oh, your mum's had a tough time. No wonder she forgets things sometimes. There's someone I know who can help you with all this. Take as much time as you need to tell me all about it. Look, I haven't got time to sort this out now. Can we talk again next week? I can understand why you've been so upset. It's really good that you've told me about what's worrying you. let's go and talk to Ruby about what she's been doing. I wonder which of those options you chose. Now, some of them are absolutely fine to say in response, and some of them wouldn't be appropriate. So let's just have a quick look now. Of the statements, there were 4 that I picked out, which I felt were the most appropriate. So we'll just start with those. So we've already mentioned about passing on a concern and not promising confidentiality. So the first of those green statements is there's someone I know who can help you. And that, of course, would be referring to the class teacher in the context of coming in as a volunteer. We know that we want to encourage the children to feel safe, to be able to talk. So giving Jacey the opportunity to continue talking after she's finished would also be appropriate. So you might say something like, you know, do take as much time as you need. I've got time to be able to talk to you. Being able to empathise and say, I can see now why you've been so upset. I understand now would also be appropriate. And encouraging them by acknowledging the fact that they have shared this information is also a really useful thing to say. Now, the likelihood is you wouldn't say all 4 of those things one after the other, and you will need to be reassured that you will have the confidence to say what's right. There are some things that wouldn't be appropriate. So in a moment, we're going to move on to talk about how important it is that we record disclosures. And sometimes when you're an adult, you know when a child is making a disclosure that you are going to need to write things down. But it's really important that we don't distract a child by saying, oh, stop a second, I know I need to write this down, so I'm going to write it down now. You just need to be making a mental note of those things. The number one priority, we'll talk about this again in a moment, is that after the disclosure has finished and the child has moved on, that you then write down that information as quickly as possible while it's fresh in your mind. The second of those bullet points around your mum's had a tough time, no wonder she forgets things sometimes, is a dangerous thing to say, because while you're trying to empathise with mum, you're also making it okay in Jacey's eyes that her mother is doing those things. So the message there really is try not to cast a judgment about what the child has said. So you don't need to say that's not okay, your mum shouldn't be doing that, but equally you don't want to be making an excuse and saying that's okay for your mum to do that. There's no need for you to pass a judgment of any description. The third of those bullet points, look, I haven't got time to sort this out now, let's talk again next week, isn't an appropriate response, because A, we're giving the child the message we don't have time for them, and B, when a child is ready to make a disclosure, that might be a small window during which time the child makes a disclosure. Next week, they may not be in a place where they're able to do that. So it's really important that we seize that moment and we enable a child to make a disclosure. The final of those things, let's go and talk to Ruby about what she's been doing. I would recommend that as a volunteering school, that is not an appropriate thing to do. It's far more appropriate to flag up that disclosure with the class teacher, who will then think deeply about the best way of responding, and very often will come and have a conversation about the best way of responding. Hopefully that's a really helpful set of guidelines and experience to help you to feel confident about how you might respond. Okay, let's move on then. So the next section is about reporting and recording. Okay, those two are sit really closely together. So if we just recap very briefly, the first thing that we did was to recognise, didn't we? And we looked at what those possible indicators of abuse were. Then we thought about how we were going to respond in the event of a child making a disclosure. And now we kind of move into the aftermath of the disclosure about what you need to do next. Okay, so we know that you need to report that disclosure. Reporting is the passing on of information. Now here it says to the designated safeguarding lead. At Fishbourne Primary School, I am the designated safeguarding lead as the head teacher of the school, and in my absence our deputy Nicola Buchan is the deputy designated safeguarding lead. We have 2 further safeguarding leads in school, Emily Harris, who you're going to meet in next week's training, who's our early years leader, and Catherine Williams, who is our year 3 class teacher, who's another member of our leadership team. So we actually have 4 designated safeguarding leads in school. As I've said before, as your immediate point of contact, the class teacher for the class who you've been assigned to, be a really good person to talk to. And then they may point you in the direction of the designated safeguarding lead team. Okay. Sometimes you'll be unsure of whether to report or not. It can be hard to judge. You should always do so, even if you are unsure. And I think that's really important as volunteers. You don't want to be walking out of the front door thinking, I wonder if I should have told somebody. No class teacher will ever mind you sharing a concern that you have. None of our staff team will mind. So please do, even if you're unsure. Reporting is about getting the right people involved, and from the concern that you have shared, the designated safeguarding leadership team will then take that case on and make the decisions. And again, I'll share with you a little bit later how we go about doing that. It isn't for you to worry about whether further action is required, but you are responsible for passing on what you know. And this final point about it being a missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle is the most important point of all. Very often there are many pieces of the puzzle for families, and it requires everyone to share the concern they may have in order for all of those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to come together to truly understand what is happening in a family. So that importance of your piece of the jigsaw puzzle may just be enough to ensure that we're able to get that support into place. Now for the recording part. So very often we are in a position where a disclosure has happened or we've made an observation, and then you may be asked to fill in what we call at Fishbourne a cause for concern form. Now, I'm just going to move our screen on to what that looks like. It's really blurred because of the way it's been uploaded into our presentation, but this is what we call our record of concern form. If you find yourself in a position where you are filling one of these in, it will be because either the class teacher or one of our designated safeguarding leads has asked you to do so. And this is what the form looks like. So there's a place there for you to fill in the child's name and the child's date of birth. Now that part, please don't worry about. That's a part that we would fill in as a staff team, so you don't need to have that information. But the child's name will be important. The date that that the concern took place is filled in here, and the name and the job title of the person making the record. So you would just write your name and volunteer next to that. And then underneath we've got this piece of information which says factual account of what happened. What happened? Where did it happen? Who was there? And then next to it, it says try to use the child's exact words, indicating with the use of speech marks. When we come onto the case study, you will understand what we mean by that. And then underneath, we've got that opportunity for you to add any information, any observation or interpretation of that situation. So it might be that you add in that the child was visibly upset as they were talking. You then sign that record and you put the date and the time when you made the record. Now, in theory, your date of concern and the date and the time of the record should be aligned. Very occasionally, historically in schools, the concern might have happened prior to the record being made. And it's important that we know that, if that is the case. What we're aiming for as part of good practice is that it would have been recorded at the same time or very soon after that had happened. And then underneath this is a part that our leadership team fill in, and this is really important. It's important because we need to know what action has taken place as a result of that. So you can see here, we record who's taken the action, what action, what action was taken, and what resulted as a result of that action. Okay, and we will fill that in as a running record to ensure that we have considered every cause for concern that has been raised. So that's what the form looks like. I'm just going to go back one slide to see what our top tips are in relation to recording our concerns. So here it says, as soon as possible, handwritten, as much detail as you can, shared with the correct person, again means class teacher or one of the safeguarding leadership team. No photographs. If there is a concern, as there was with our first case study about markings to the skin, there will also be a body map, which is enclosed in our policy, which is available on our website, but again we would provide you with that, where you would just record on a body map where that injury or mark was. Just remember that your note taking could really make a difference to that child. Okay, so those are the key messages about note taking. That's what our record of concern looks like. Again, the class teacher or myself or one of my safeguarding leadership team would provide you with a copy of that. There are copies in our staff room and also in our first aid room that staff are able to access at any time as well. Okay, so this is our third and final case study. Okay, what's going to happen with this case study is you're going to put yourself in the position of being the person hearing the disclosure. We're going to go through the 3 stages that we've mentioned already. What I'd like you to think about is what the indicators are of possible abuse. I'd like you to think about how you would respond to Ellie and what you would say. And I'd like you to listen really carefully, thinking, okay, I know I'm going to have to fill in a cause for concern form for Ellie, and there are certain things that I need to remember as I'm doing so. That's quite a lot to think about, isn't it? And it's a reminder of why we're doing this training, because actually being responsible for the safeguarding of our children is quite a big responsibility, and it requires a high level of skill. So hopefully you've got your piece of paper and pencil or pen in front of you. Okay, so just to recap the activity, you're going to hear a disclosure as a member of our volunteer team at Fishbourne. As you hear the disclosure, you're going to think about what are the possible signs of abuse. You're going to look to recognise the possible signs of abuse. You're going to think about how you would respond if you were sitting with Ellie in that moment. And you're also going to be thinking about making a mental note of what you might say. Now, the golden rule with this activity is, as you're listening to the disclosure, you must not write anything down, okay? So we'll do the disclosure, we'll recap the activity, and then you can have a go at writing. Okay, shall we get going? So this is Ellie. I don't want to go swimming anymore. I don't like Bill. He's the man on the bus that takes us. When he puts my wheelchair on the bus, he touches me on my private parts. He said it felt nice. He asked if I liked it, but I don't. He told me to keep it a secret or I'd be in trouble. I said I don't like secrets and I'll tell on him. He said he'd call me a liar if I told, and then I'd get into trouble. He does it to Gracie too, but she doesn't like it either. When I said I was going to tell, he held my arm really tight and it hurt me. Will I get into trouble? What are the possible signs of abuse? What are you going to say in response to Ellie in that moment? And what are you going to write down? I highly recommend you press pause now and reflect on those 3 R's and have a go at that activity. And then we'll come back together. a tricky disclosure, wasn't it? And a very difficult disclosure for you to hear as a volunteer or a member of staff at Fishbourne Primary School. You can see how the advice of keeping calm is really important, can't you? In terms of recognising the potential abuse, you can see there that there's a physical and a sexual risk of abuse there. Both of those things Ellie mentions explicitly in her disclosure. So our alarm bells are ringing very, very loudly, and there's no question whatsoever about whether this is a cause for concern. In terms of what you might say in response to Ellie, she gives you the opportunity to respond to a question at the end of her disclosure. And her question, her most pressing question, is, will I get into trouble? Now, when we think back to the appropriate ways to respond, all the advice is there. Staying calm, listening carefully, clarifying essential information, offering reassurance, letting Ellie know what's going to happen next, and then without any delay, you doing so. When you respond to her question, am I going to get into trouble? Your answer can be very clear that Ellie won't be getting into trouble and that you thank her very much for sharing that information with her. You reassure her that people are in school who will be able to help her, and you reassure her that you're going to let people know straight away so that we can do the right things in school to support her. Now, in terms of what you've written down on your disclosure, that will look different for all of you, I'm sure. The part of the advice in terms of what we write down, if you remember that what we can remember that they definitely said, we're able to put into speech marks, but only if we know with certainty that they definitely said it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read that disclosure again, and you can just look back over your notes and see what was said and what you have remembered as being said. I don't want to go swimming anymore. I don't like Bill. He's the man on the bus that takes us. When he puts my wheelchair on the bus, he touches my private parts. He said it felt nice. He asked if I liked it, but I don't. He told me to keep it a secret or I'd be in trouble. I said I don't like secrets and I'll tell on him. He said he'd call me a liar if I told, and then I'd get into trouble. He does it to Gracie too, but she doesn't like it either. When I said I was going to tell, he held my arm really tight, and it hurt me. Will I get into trouble? I imagine if you're anything like us as a staff team in the school, you won't have managed to record all of that in your disclosure, in your cause for concern. And that's really normal and typical. I think when you're listening to a disclosure, you learn over time, and the more practice you have with case studies, to pull out those key pieces of information as you're listening. So thinking about the name of the person, being really clear about which adult it is that Ellie's talking about. And that might be the sort of thing that you would clarify. So one of our tips around responding to the child is that sometimes you need to clarify pieces of information, and clarifying the name of the person that child was talking about would be really key, wouldn't it? The other thing I want to just say about recording your record of concern is that the sooner you do it, the better. And we have a golden rule at Fishbourne that safeguarding trumps everything. So in the event, for example, of a class teacher having a disclosure made by a child, we would do everything we could to release that member of staff to come out of the classroom immediately to record that disclosure. That might mean somebody else covering them. And in your case, it might be you just saying to the class teacher, I'm not able to take another child to hear them reading at the moment because I just need to fill in the record for concern, and leave it at that. But the speed with which it's recorded after the disclosure is really key to keep the information fresh in your own minds. You're doing really well if you're still sticking with us, and I appreciate that time is ticking on, and by the time you've paused this film on a number of occasions, we're probably fast approaching having been together for an hour. So I just want to share with you briefly what happens next after you've made that disclosure, so that you have an understanding of what happens behind the scenes, and then just a few takeaway messages really about things that we'd like you to remember. If this training has raised questions for you, one of the difficulties of presenting in this way is that you don't have the opportunity for it to be a dialogue and to talk to each other and learn from each other, which we recognise is really, really important. But if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. My email address is head@fishbourneprimary.co.uk, or you're very welcome to give me a call and if you've got any questions that crop up as a result of this training. But then what happens next? So in school, we have a very clear protocol for what happens following a disclosure or a concern that has been raised. And we have a flow diagram that looks a little bit like this. Hopefully you can see this clearly on your screens. But we follow through this series of steps. What I suggest you do is that you just press pause on this film now so that you can have a little look through these steps. As you can see, there are no questions really about what we do next. In terms of what you know as a volunteer, having made a disclosure, having had a disclosure made and then filling in a record for concern, is we will keep you up to date. We will let you know what has happened as a result of the cause for concern that you have filled in, but you will only find out what you need to know. So it might be that we say that we made a decision to refer on, and that's all that you need to know. We certainly wouldn't tell you what the outcome of that has been. But it is really important that you feel confident that you can challenge us about what has happened as a result of raising that concern. That is something that you should feel able to do. The other thing that I will say, and we say to all of our staff, is that you are always able to make a referral yourself if you feel that is the right thing to do. That this happens because sometimes when you look at what are called serious case reviews, where something has gone wrong and a child very sadly has died as a result of a series of failures in the safeguarding protocols in schools and in other settings, they very often look back, and one of the patterns of behaviour is that people feel they have passed their concern on and therefore it's over. And schools have been guilty of this in the past, so whereby somebody might phone up the multi-agency safeguarding hub and they think, oh, I've done my job, that's it, don't need to worry about that anymore. But that is not the case. And what we do in school is if we have made a referral to the multi-agency safeguarding hub, we then follow that up again and again and again until we are happy that the situation has resolved itself in the way that is most appropriate. We don't sit back and think, oh, we haven't heard anything back from them, so we don't need to worry about that. It's really important that everybody continues to ask questions until that has been resolved. Okay. So earlier on in the presentation, we talked a little bit about what happens, why some people don't share their concerns. And if we go right back to that first case study of Sally at the Children and Family Centre, do you remember she said she didn't want to flag up the concern because she didn't want to rock the boat. She didn't want to lose families from the Child and Family Centre. Those sorts of concerns are significant in schools. We work really hard to have positive relationships with families who come to our school. And sometimes it's a concern to us when we have to make a referral on that we will lose those positive relationships. But we know that we have a duty of care to report any concerns that we have, and we share that with our families right from the moment their children come to Fishbourne Primary School. That is always has to be paramount. It has to be our priority. That if there is a safeguarding concern, that is shared with the appropriate professionals. These are some of the reasons that people have shared for not having reported their concerns. The first is feeling there's no one to talk to who will listen and can be trusted. That's really concerning, isn't it? That in schools, that members of staff have said they feel that that is not going to help and support them as a professional. It's really important that you know as a volunteer at Fishbourne Primary School that there are people who will listen if you have a concern. Fear of not being listened to or understood or being taken seriously or being believed. A belief in self-reliance, a sense that by sharing problems nothing will change, and an embarrassment related to that. Now, interestingly, all of these things also impact on children and families who may not share their concerns too. It impacts on every level of people who are involved in safeguarding. There might be a concern about not wanting to burden other people, or a fear of getting yourself or somebody else into trouble. There might be a fear about overreacting and making matters worse, a fear of losing control of the situation, a limited knowledge of what services are available and how they might be able to help, a stigma associated with the involvement of formal agencies, and personal experiences that impact on the way that we behave around safeguarding concerns. This is the crux of the matter. This is why it's so important. If we have a concern, we share it. It is the responsibility of professionals, and within that we consider volunteers to be part of that, all adults in school, to report their concerns, not to decide whether it is or is not child abuse. So it's about reporting. That is the key. Child protection and safeguarding is a multidisciplinary activity. No individual should ever feel sole responsibility for identifying abuse rests with them. And then that final message, which is so important, the worst thing we can do is to do nothing at all. Okay, these are our parting thoughts, our reflections to share with you, to take away as your takeaway messages. Safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children is everyone's responsibility. Everyone who comes into contact with children and their families has a role to play. In order to fulfil this responsibility effectively, all professionals should make sure their approach is child-centred. This means that they should consider at all times what is in the best interests of the child. This means both inside and outside school. All staff and volunteers have a responsibility to provide a safe environment in which children can learn. All staff and volunteers should be prepared to identify children who may benefit from early help. Any staff member or volunteer who has a concern about a child's welfare should be able to follow the referral process. Okay, this final slide is an important one. We say that about every slide. So if for any reason that you don't feel that your concern has been taken seriously, I mentioned this a little bit earlier when we had the flow diagram, you have some options available to you. So the options are, we've got a confidential reporting policy which is available on our school website. Our Chair of Governors and Safeguarding Lead, Julie Barwell, and her email address is on the screen, and that's all. The email address is also available on our website. The telephone number for the West Sussex Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub is there, and so too is the telephone number for the NSPCC, who offer super advice about what to do if you find yourself in the position outlined above. As a school community and a school family, we very much hope we never find ourselves in a position whereby our staff or volunteers need to take this route, but it is very important that you know that route is available should you need it. I just want to finish by saying thank you again. Thank you for being our everyday heroes. We really hope that as a result of this rather unusual training session online, you will feel better equipped to recognise, respond, report and record any safeguarding concerns you have when you are in our school community. We've just got a list of the key people now. So we've got the designated safeguarding lead, who's me, Naomi Day, the deputy designated safeguarding lead, who is Nicola Buchan, who is our deputy head and our year 6 teacher, and then 2 further members of staff who are also now trained as DSLs, and that's Catherine Williams, who's our year 3 teacher, and Emily Harris, who is our early years teacher. And then, as we've already mentioned, our governor with responsibility for safeguarding is Julie Barwell, who is our chair of governors. As I said earlier in the presentation, if you have any questions or concerns raised as a result of this session, please don't hesitate to ask. I very much hope that when you come for your first visit to Fishbourne in September, we will be able to do a quick refresher based on this training with any updates that we might have, and that some of the discussion we have as part of that will help you to feel even more confident. But as I said, if you've got any worries in the meantime, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you for spending this time today doing this piece of training, and we really, really look forward to welcoming you into our school community soon. Take care. Bye-bye.